Many talented people of colour were snubbed in major categories. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. The Hollywood foreign press are all very, very racist.
In January of 2020, a comedian stood on a stage in front of 200 of the most powerful people in Hollywood, held a beer, and told them exactly what he thought of them. 5 years later, a wave of newly released government documents landed with names attached to them. In the middle of all this, a beloved daytime host has spent the last several years locked in a legal fight just to be recognized as capable of making her own decisions. And a talk show legend built an entire 19-year brand on a single phrase before walking away from the industry that made her famous. These are 3 separate stories. They did not happen because of each other, and there is no single hidden thread connecting them into one master conspiracy. But each one says something real about what it costs to speak inside an industry built on image, and what it costs to have your image quietly come apart. So let's go through what actually happened, in order, starting with the night a comedy monologue made 200 million people go completely silent. Ricky Gervais had hosted the Golden Globes 4 times before that January night in 2020. Each time, he pushed a little further than the year before. By his 5th outing, he had clearly decided that softening the material wasn't worth it anymore. He walked onto the stage at the Beverly Hilton, beer in hand, and opened by telling the audience he genuinely did not care what they thought of him that night. That line got a laugh. What followed did not always land the same way. He worked through Felicity Huffman and the college admission scandal. He turned on the streaming services filling the room, telling the crowd that the corporations they represented were willing to sign deals with almost anyone regardless of their conduct. Each joke carried a little more edge than the one before it, and the room's laughter got thinner as he went. Then he brought up Jeffrey Epstein directly. He told the audience, on camera, that plenty of people in that room had flown on Epstein's plane, and that they knew who else had been on it. He said it standing in front of 200 million viewers at home. Cameras caught faces in the crowd that had stopped performing amusement. It wasn't the kind of silence a joke earns when it simply fails. It was the silence of a room that recognized itself. At that point, Epstein had been dead for 5 months. He died in a Manhattan jail cell in August 2019, and the official finding was suicide, a conclusion that forensic experts hired independently by his family publicly disputed. The broader cache of documents connecting Epstein to figures across entertainment, finance, and politics was still years away from being made public. So when Gervais stood at that podium describing private planes and undisclosed friendships, he was working from suspicion, tabloid reporting, and rumor that had circulated for years, not from confirmed documents. That distinction matters because it's tempting, in hindsight, to treat his monologue as if he had access to files nobody else did. He didn't. He was repeating what a lot of people in the industry already privately believed, out loud, at a moment nobody expected him to. Gervais was never invited back to host the Golden Globes after that. He has said so himself, repeatedly, without much apparent regret. In interviews since, he's described his approach that night using an old framework from British comedy. The stand-up comedian as court jester. The jester's job, as he's put it, is to say the thing everyone in the room already knows, but nobody with something to lose is willing to say out loud. The jester can get away with it because the jester has nothing the king can take from him. He's also said he wasn't really performing for the celebrities in front of him. He was performing for the audience watching at home, people without private planes or industry protection. It's worth remembering that this wasn't Gervais's first time pushing boundaries at that ceremony. Across his 4 previous times hosting, he'd built a reputation for jokes that made industry insiders visibly uncomfortable. Cracks about Scientology, about actors' personal lives, about the hypocrisy of award show speeches. Each year, the reaction was some version of shock followed by grudging acceptance. And the ceremony invited him back anyway, because discomfort was still good television. What made 2020 different wasn't just the subject matter. It was the specificity. Naming a person by name in connection to a real criminal case involving minors is a different category of risk than a generalized joke about Hollywood hypocrisy. That's likely part of why it was the appearance that ended his run as host. even though it wasn't necessarily his most abrasive monologue by other measures. The reaction outside the room was also different from what happened inside it. Clips of the Epstein section circulated widely online in the days after, with plenty of viewers treating it as one of the few honest moments in modern award show history. Other commentators pushed back, arguing that a joke referencing unproven associations wasn't accountability. It was innuendo dressed up as courage, delivered by someone who faced none of the consequences he implied others should. Both readings can be true at once. A joke can be a genuine act of saying an uncomfortable thing out loud, and it can also fall short of actual investigation or evidence. Gervais's monologue was the former. It took the 2026 document release, years later, to begin supplying something closer to the latter. That same directness is part of what makes her current situation land so heavily for people who followed her career. The woman known for speaking without much of a filter has spent the last several years unable to fully speak for herself in public because of a guardianship dispute working through the New York courts. It's a genuinely difficult irony, and it's one that's been noted repeatedly by entertainment reporters and guardianship reform advocates alike, not because anyone has proven a connection between her outspokenness and her current legal situation, but because the contrast between who she was on television and what's happened to her since is simply stark on its own terms. That guardianship began in 2022, when Wells Fargo raised concerns with a New York court about Williams' ability to manage her own financial affairs, after a financial advisor reportedly flagged her as being of unsound mind. A court-appointed guardian, Sabrina Morrissey, was given authority over her finances and, over time, significant control over her personal life and living situation. In 2023, Williams was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia and aphasia, a diagnosis her guardian's legal team later cited in court filings, describing her as permanently incapacitated. Williams has publicly disputed that characterization more than once, including in a January 2025 call-in interview with The Breakfast Club, where she said she did not feel cognitively impaired and described her situation using words like isolation and captivity, feelings, not medical findings, but ones she stated clearly and consistently. The legal picture shifted significantly in late 2025 when a neurologist unconnected to her existing medical team examined her and reportedly found no evidence of frontotemporal dementia, a diagnosis that typically worsens over time rather than improving, which made the new finding notable enough that outlets covering guardianship law took it seriously. Her attorney, Joe Tacopina, has since said publicly that he expects the guardianship to end, citing that evaluation along with what he's described as her sustained sobriety over the past few years. As of the middle of 2026, though, the guardianship itself remains active, and the broader legal questions around it are still working through the courts. Her son, Kevin Hunter Jr., has been an outspoken and sometimes controversial figure in the dispute, having reportedly been connected to the very financial concerns that triggered the original guardianship petition, a detail that complicates any version of this story that tries to paint it as simple. A Lifetime documentary about her life and situation aired during this period as well, generating enough attention that her guardian's team responded to it directly in court filings, calling it a distorted account, while people close to Williams described it as the most accurate picture of her circumstances that had reached the public. Two very different reactions to the same film, filed in the same courtroom, about the same woman, who has had limited ability to speak for herself throughout most of this process. The case has also become a reference point in a much larger conversation happening in New York and beyond about how guardianship law actually functions. Under New York's Article 81 guardianship statute, a court-appointed guardian is required to file annual reports covering the ward's health, living situation, social life, and finances, and courts can also appoint an independent evaluator to represent the ward's interests directly to the judge. In theory, that structure is designed to prevent exactly the kind of overreach Williams's supporters allege has happened in her case. In practice, critics of the guardianship system, including journalists who've covered these cases for years, argue that once a guardianship is established, the burden of proof effectively shifts, and it becomes extremely difficult for the person under guardianship to demonstrate they no longer need it, even when new medical evidence emerges. Some New York lawmakers have pointed to Williams's case, specifically while pushing for legislative reforms that would create independent oversight boards, guarantee awards right to their own legal counsel, and require greater transparency around guardian fees and decision-making. Whatever the eventual outcome, her case has become one of the more closely watched examples of how adult guardianship law functions in practice, drawing comparisons to the Britney Spears conservatorship battle that ended in 2022 after years of public pressure. Advocates for guardianship reform have pointed to it repeatedly while pushing for stronger oversight and clearer rights for people placed under these arrangements, arguing that regardless of how anyone feels about Williams personally, the legal mechanism itself deserves scrutiny. Then there's Ellen DeGeneres, whose story runs on an entirely different track from either of these, but touches the same industry at the same moment in its history. For 19 years, the Ellen DeGeneres show closed every episode with the same instruction: be kind to one another. That phrase became the foundation of a brand worth hundreds of millions of dollars, printed on merchandise, quoted constantly, treated as shorthand for what the show represented. For most of that run, it worked exactly as intended. In July 2020, BuzzFeed News published a detailed investigation built on accounts from dozens of former staff members across multiple departments and years of the show's production. The picture those accounts painted had little in common with the show's public image. Former employees described a workplace culture shaped by fear rather than warmth, citing instructions not to make eye contact with DeGeneres, and an environment where raising concerns wasn't treated as acceptable. Warner Media opened a formal investigation in response, and 3 of the show's top producers were removed from their roles. DeGeneres addressed the situation on air when the next season began, acknowledging that things had happened on her show that shouldn't have. She announced the show would end in 2021, and the final episode aired in May 2022. In the final weeks of the show's run, the vast majority of major celebrity guests who appeared offered warm tributes to DeGeneres and the show's legacy, treating its conclusion as the natural end of a long, successful run rather than a story about workplace culture. That framing was notable given what had been reported just 2 years earlier, and it says something about how quickly an industry can move past a story once the immediate news cycle passes. DeGeneres has since relocated to the United Kingdom, settling with her wife Portia de Rossi in the English countryside, and has said publicly she doesn't plan to return to the United States in the near future. In interviews since leaving, she has described feeling that she became an unfair target and that the criticism she faced was disproportionate to what actually happened on her show, framing the entire episode as something that pushed her out of an industry and a country she'd spent decades building a life in. The former staff members who spoke to reporters about their experiences working on the show have offered a very different account of what proportionate would actually look like, describing patterns of behavior that went on for years across multiple seasons and multiple departments, not an isolated incident or a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by the press. It's worth being precise about what was actually reported and what wasn't. The BuzzFeed investigation and the subsequent Warner Media inquiry focused on workplace culture and management conduct, not on DeGeneres' personal life or personal relationships. The 3 producers removed from their roles were held responsible for the environment described by former staff. DeGeneres herself was not accused of the specific behaviors detailed in the reporting, though she acknowledged responsibility for the culture of the show she headlined, saying she was ultimately accountable for what happened under her name even if she wasn't present for every incident described. What ties these 3 stories together isn't a hidden conspiracy or a secret they were all part of. It's something simpler and honestly more useful to think about: the different costs of speaking, staying silent, or getting caught in an industry that has spent decades getting very good at managing all 3. Gervais spoke from a position of real independence, international stand-up success, financial security, and a career that never depended on Hollywood's goodwill. Losing the Golden Globes hosting gig cost him almost nothing, because his position was never built on the people he was criticizing. Williams was never in that position. Her income, her platform, and her daily life were embedded in the very industry she spent years commenting on, which means the cost she's paid: a lost show, lost financial control, and years inside a legal arrangement she's actively contesting, has been far heavier and far more personal. DeGeneres occupied a different role altogether. Not someone naming uncomfortable truths, but someone whose carefully built public image concealed a very different internal reality, one that eventually became impossible to keep separate from the brand. None of that adds up to a unified secret plot. It adds up to something more mundane and in its own way more important. An entertainment industry where speaking plainly, staying quiet, or maintaining an image all carry real, unequal costs depending on how much power you actually hold. Gervais still isn't hosting the Golden Globes. Wendy Williams is still working through her case in court, with real hope from her own legal team that it may resolve soon. Ellen DeGeneres is still living in the UK, and the broader reckoning around figures connected to Epstein's documented network is still playing out in real time, with more names and more consequences likely still to come. If you want to go deeper on any one of these three stories, the Golden Globes monologue, the Wendy Williams guardianship case, or the fallout from the Ellen DeGeneres investigation, let us know in the comments which one you'd like covered in full detail next. And if you found this rundown useful, consider subscribing for more clear, sourced breakdowns of the stories everyone's talking about, but few people are